What happens when the system designed to help the most vulnerable is instead systematically looted? And what if that looting not only fuels political corruption, but casts a shadow that reaches all the way to global terror organizations? That is the very serious question facing the state of Minnesota right now.
It is. We're about to dive into what is really a monumental failure of state governance, a crisis that's been escalating over the last few years. And the urgency of all this was, just thrown into sharp relief recently with the arrest of a man named Abdul Dahir Ibrahim.
And this wasn't just any routine arrest, right? We're talking about an illegal Somali migrant who, sources show, had a deportation order hanging over his head since 2004. And he already had convictions for welfare and asylum fraud from his time in Canada. So the question isn't just why he was still here, but who he knew.
Exactly. Ibrahim wasn't some hidden figure. The sources detail photographs of him standing right alongside some of Minnesota's most prominent DFL politicians. We're talking Governor Tim Walz, Representative Ilhan Omar, State Senator Omar Fateh.
And that's where the line between crime and power starts to get, well, impossible to ignore. Senator Fateh and a Minneapolis City Council member, they did more than just a photo op. They actually wrote formal letters of recommendation for this convicted fraudster.
They did during his immigration proceedings. This single incident, while small compared to the whole picture, it's just a crucial illustration of this troubling link. The link between what critics are calling political patronage and the systemic fraud that has just been allowed to flourish in the state for years.
So our mission today is to dive deep into Minnesota's social services meltdown. A failure so complete the total fraud is now expected to exceed $1 billion. Some are even calling the state the Medicaid fraud capital of the USA.
And it's really vital for you, the listener, to understand this wasn't one bad apple, not one isolated event. As one acting U.S. attorney put it, this is schemes stacked upon schemes, all draining resources meant for the state's truly needy citizens.
Okay, let's start with the numbers in part one. Because the sheer scale of the theft, it's just staggering. And it all seems to center on programs for the most vulnerable. Children, people needing housing.
The biggest case, the one that really blew the lid off all of this, is the Feeding Our Future scheme. That case alone involved $250 million stolen from federal child nutrition funds.
$250 million. How on earth did they manage to get that much money out of a child nutrition program?
Well, the fraud was basically supercharged by COVID-19. To get aid out the door quickly, the government relaxed a lot of the oversight rules. And that created an environment with, virtually zero accountability. Organizations could claim reimbursement just by submitting fabricated invoices. Fake meal counts for millions of imaginary meals.
Wait, so a group could just say they fed 5,000 kids 3 meals a day and the state would just sign the check, without proof those kids even existed?
In many, many cases, yes. The checks were signed. The pressure from the top was all about speed and access, not due diligence. They waived basic common sense requirements, and the fraudsters just moved right in.
And Feeding Our Future, that was just the first domino to fall. Once investigators started looking, they found this everywhere, right? Like in housing fraud.
The next big one was the Medicaid Housing Stabilization Services Program, or HSS. This helps people with disabilities or people facing homelessness find stable housing. It was supposed to cost about $2.6 million a year.
A reasonable number. But the sources show it didn't stay reasonable for long.
Not at all. In just 1 year, the cost of that HSS program shot up to $104 million.
Wow.
And federal prosecutors have said the vast majority of that was fraudulent. The tactics were almost crude. They created what they called purely fictitious companies.
So businesses that just existed on paper.
Exactly. Their only purpose was to send fake bills to the state. Billing for services never rendered, for housing that didn't exist.
That's just breathtaking negligence. To let costs rise like that without an immediate full-scale audit. But the third scheme you found in the sources, it might be the worst, morally, because it targeted children with autism.
This is where the fraud got close to $500 million in claims. We saw claims for autism services jump from just $3 million in 2018 to an incredible $399 million in 2023.
$399 million. Let me just put that in perspective for a second. That's more than a 100-fold increase in 5 years. That spike alone should have been a screaming red flag. How did they do it?
It was a highly organized kickback scheme. Providers would allegedly facilitate fraudulent autism diagnoses, that's what opens up the state funding, and then use taxpayer money to pay the parents cash kickback.
Cash kickbacks. Explain how that worked.
The sources say the payments were anywhere from $300 to $1,500 per month per child.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. The payments were contingent on the services being authorized. So parents were essentially being paid to sign their kids up, whether they had autism or not. The providers, of course, they pocketed the rest of the reimbursement from the state.
Hold on. There's a statistic in your sources on this that is just, it's one of the most disturbing parts of this whole thing. What was the diagnosis rate?
The sources note that 1 in 16 Somali 4-year-olds in Minnesota was reportedly diagnosed with autism. That rate is more than triple the state average.
1 in 16. That number, I mean, that suggests the fraud was the entire point, not some side effect. How did providers get away with this without a single state official stepping in sooner?
And that leads us right into part 2, how the system itself was, you could argue, designed for failure. A lot of people think of Minnesota as this well-run state, but the evidence here suggests that, well, politically motivated processes just prioritized easy access over basic security.
So what was the big structural flaw? What allowed this billion-dollar hole to open up?
It's fascinating, really. It comes down to this incredible degree of misplaced trust. Several of these huge programs, including that $104 million housing service, were built on an honor system. They had low barriers to entry and minimal requirements for reimbursement. The state just assumed these nonprofits were being truthful.
So the political goal was to get money out the door, fast, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And they just decided to trust everyone instead of putting in the tough oversight that you need with taxpayer money.
It's a huge risk. And the state made it worse by just ignoring red flag after red flag. Officials were heavily criticized for failing to take action, even when complaints were pouring in.
You'd think when the theft is in the tens or hundreds of millions, somebody somewhere would just stop the payments. But the sources detail one instance that just perfectly captures the failure.
An astonishing instance. It was with the Feeding Our Future fraud. The state got complaints that some of the properties these groups claimed to be serving food from didn't even exist. Phantom addresses? And the way they handled it was just inexcusable.
So what do?
They referred the complaints directly to the alleged fraudsters. They asked the CEO of Feeding Our Future to resolve the issue.
Wait. They asked the people they suspected of stealing $250 million to investigate themselves.
Precisely. And while they were waiting for the fraudsters to report back on their own fraud, the state continued payment to those same sites.
I mean, that's not just negligence. That borders on institutional complicity. You can't tell where laziness ends and a deliberate cover-up begins.
And that's the shift, from bureaucratic failure to political failure. Which brings us to part 3, the really disturbing allegations of political protection from the highest levels of state government.
This goes way beyond just bad oversight. We have sources detailing some very serious accusations from people inside the system.
We do. According to the sources, employees at the Department of Human Services openly accused Governor Tim Walz of orchestrating a sweeping cover-up to protect the fraud ring. Insiders alleged Walz didn't just ignore the warnings, he actively retaliated against employees who tried to expose the theft.
And if you connect the dots, his administration wasn't just passive, they were allegedly blocking accountability. Governor Walz reportedly worked with Democrats in the state legislature, the DFL, to block a bill that would have created an independent inspector general's office.
Right, an office specifically designed to investigate fraud in state agencies.
Which raises the question, why would any politician oppose a basic tool to protect taxpayers, especially when hundreds of millions are already missing?
Critics argue the answer is political patronage.
Okay, let's look at the Attorney General, Keith Ellison. Your sources detail his involvement with some of the people who were later federally indicted for the Feeding Our Future scam.
The documents show Attorney General Ellison met with key figures in that operation, and shortly after that meeting, he received $15,000 in donations from sources linked to Feeding Our Future. And according to a recording that's cited in the source material, Ellison actually assured them that their state funding would continue. He promised to personally fight these people, meaning the state officials trying to pause payments to get their money flowing again.
Is there any scenario where that's not corrupt? The Attorney General meeting with people later indicted for massive fraud and promising to fight his own state officials on their behalf.
The only context critics offer is political calculation. that powerful figures were putting donor relationships and community influence ahead of the law. And when state officials did try to push back, the accused groups had a playbook to stop them.
The discrimination playbook, right.
Precisely. When officials tried to delay or reject an application over fraud concerns, the organizations would just file a lawsuit alleging racial discrimination. Critics called it the standard operating playbook to shield criminal behavior and just silence anyone who might expose them.
So the argument became, if you question where hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars went, you're racist. It creates a chilling effect on any kind of real oversight. And this leads to the most provocative theory in all the source material, the electoral loyalty theory.
This theory suggests that the state's permissive attitude wasn't an accident, that it was a deliberate political strategy by Democrats, the DFL party, to secure the loyalty of the Somali community, which is a key voting bloc.
And the way to secure that loyalty?
By allowing influential community members, the ones running these nonprofits, to get nice and rich. The party could then count on these newly wealthy organizers to, deliver the community's votes for the DFL. It's a system of political patronage funded
theft directly to a calculated electoral strategy. But the implications of this go far beyond Minnesota. We have to address the national security shadow hanging over this whole crisis.
This is the most high-stakes implication. It's coming from federal counterterrorism sources. They allege that millions of dollars in stolen funds from Minnesota have been sent overseas to Somalia, and that the money eventually landed in the hands of the terror group Al-Shabaab.
That's an explosive, frankly terrifying charge. U.S. taxpayer money, meant for kids, potentially ending up with a major terror organization.
The sheer volume of money flowing out of the Twin Cities led multiple confidential sources to give investigators an equally explosive quote. They said the largest funder of Al-Shabaab is the Minnesota taxpayer. This isn't just a theory, it's an active investigation.
How does that money even get there? From a Minneapolis nonprofit to a terror group in East Africa.
It's routed through informal financial networks called hawalas. For anyone who isn't familiar, hawalas are basically informal, trust-based money transfer systems. They operate completely outside of regulated banking. They're clan-based and notoriously hard for Western governments to track.
So millions of dollars just disappear into this system.
A retired official from the Joint Terrorism Task Force determined that untold millions were routed this way. And he also determined that Al-Shabaab, which controls territory in Somalia, takes a cut of every dollar transferred from the Twin Cities back home.
So whether the fraudsters meant to fund terrorism or not, Al-Shabaab was allegedly taking its share from these stolen welfare dollars.
That's the allegation.
Now, we have to pause here. We need to be absolutely clear and impartial about the status of that terror link.
Absolutely. While these are very serious claims circulating in law enforcement, federal officials have not publicly presented definitive, proven evidence of a direct link between these specific fraud proceeds and Al-Shabaab. It remains an active investigation. The U.S. Treasury Department is reviewing it all now.
But even without that final determination, what we're left with is a clear triple threat.
Yes. First, you have massive taxpayer theft, likely over $1 billion. Second, systemic government failure built on a catastrophic honor system. And third, deeply disturbing allegations of political cover-ups and patronage reaching the highest levels of the DFL state government.
The entire system of social aid relies on a high degree of civic trust, right? The idea that the money will be used honestly for the public good. That trust has just been obliterated here.
Yeah. Which leaves a pretty important question for you, the taxpayer, to think about. What happens to American civic virtue, and what are the national security risks when that trust is so systematically betrayed? What happens when clan loyalty and political patronage are allegedly prioritized over the rule of law and the sanctity of your tax dollars? It's a challenge Minnesota is facing right now, with profound consequences for every state in the country.